At 6:26 p.m. on June 10th, 2025, Gregory Hunt was pronounced dead inside Alabama's execution chamber. He was 65 years old. Strapped to a gurney with a blue-rimmed mask covering his entire face, he had given no final words. Instead, he offered a thumbs up and what appeared to be a peace sign, silent gestures that seemed to carry both defiance and surrender. Just hours before his execution, the U.S. Supreme Court had denied his final appeal. A last-ditch effort claiming prosecutors had misled jurors about sexual abuse evidence decades earlier. The Alabama Attorney General's office called his claim meritless. But Hunt's final day wasn't defined by legal briefs or appeals. It was defined by a simple lunch: bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. Prison food. The same meal he'd eaten thousands of times over 35 years on death row. How does a man who once led weekly Bible classes for fellow inmates spend his final hours? What does redemption look like when it comes at the end of a needle, or in this case, a mask filled with nitrogen gas? This is the story of Gregory Hunt's last day alive, and the woman whose brutal murder put him there. Karen Lane was 32 years old when was murdered on August 2nd, 1988. She lived in a small apartment in Cordova, Alabama, in Walker County, sharing space with a roommate and trying to build a quiet life. She had been dating Gregory Hunt for about a month. Just 4 weeks that would cost her everything. Friends would later say Karen was trusting, perhaps too much so. She couldn't have known that the man she'd let into her life carried within him a capacity for unimaginable violence. Karen's sister, who declined to speak with reporters in 2025, had once described the devastating impact of losing Karen in such a brutal way. At a 2014 vigil for crime victims, she said simply, "The way she was killed is just devastating. It's hard enough to lose a family member to death, but when it's this gruesome..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Some truths are too heavy for words. By late July 1988, Karen had seen enough of Gregory Hunt. Whatever had drawn her to him initially, maybe she saw someone troubled who needed understanding, she now recognized as dangerous. She wanted him out of her life. That decision would lead directly to her death. The night of August 1st, 1988, Gregory Hunt's jealousy boiled over into something far more brutal. Prosecutors would later piece together a night of escalating rage that ended in a small apartment where Karen Lane fought for her life and lost. Hunt, consumed by jealous fury, broke into Karen's apartment in the early morning hours of August 2nd. What happened next was methodical in its brutality. He didn't just kill Karen Lane, he destroyed her. The crime scene told a story that even seasoned investigators struggled to process. Karen had suffered 60 separate injuries. More than 20 of her ribs were fractured. Her sternum was broken. Her liver was lacerated, her aorta torn, her brain bruised from the savage beating. But the physical evidence revealed something even more horrific. Prosecutors alleged that Hunt had sexually abused Karen before killing her. A broken broom found at the scene contained human cells. The violence wasn't just about murder. It was about complete domination and degradation. Hunt would later admit to killing Karen, but consistently denied the sexual abuse throughout his 35 years on death row. This denial would become the cornerstone of his final appeals, claims that prosecutors had misled jurors about the evidence of sexual assault. Whether the denial reflected genuine memory gaps from his drug-addled state that night, or simply a killer's inability to face the full scope of his brutality, only Hunt knew for certain. The physical evidence against Gregory Hunt was overwhelming and undeniable. His fingerprints were found throughout Karen's apartment. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime scene. The trail of violence he left was impossible to ignore or explain away. But perhaps most damning was Hunt's own behavior after the murder. He didn't flee immediately or try to cover his tracks with any sophistication. Instead, he seemed almost dazed by what he'd done. Within hours of Karen's death, Hunt was making phone calls that would seal his fate. The evidence wasn't just physical, it was behavioral, testimonial, and overwhelming in its totality. When investigators pieced together the timeline, they found a man who had spiraled completely out of control in a single night. Drug abuse, which Hunt would later cite as the root cause of his actions, had stripped away whatever restraints might have prevented the ultimate act of violence. The case wasn't a mystery that needed solving, it was a tragedy that needed accounting for. Gregory Hunt was born in 1960 into a world of violence and chaos. His childhood was marked by a violent, alcoholic family, physical and sexual abuse, and early drug use that would follow him into adulthood. These weren't excuses for what he would later do. They were simply the toxic soil from which a killer grew. By 1988, Hunt was 28 years old and deep in the grip of drug addiction. He would later attribute his crime to this addiction, describing himself as someone who had lost control of his demons and poisons. But understanding the roots of violence doesn't excuse its expression. Karen Lane didn't deserve to die because Gregory Hunt had been abused as a child. She didn't deserve to suffer because he couldn't control his drug use or manage his jealousy. What makes Hunt's case particularly complex is what happened after his conviction. In prison, Hunt claimed to have found religion. He began leading weekly Bible classes in 1998, a practice he maintained for over 2 decades. He described his mission as being a light in a dark place, trying to tell other inmates that if he could change, they could too. Just trying to tell people if I can change, they can too. Become people of love instead of hate, he told the Associated Press in his final month of life. Whether this transformation was genuine spiritual growth or simply the psychological adaptation of a lifer is impossible to know. What's certain is that it came too late for Karen Lane. Gregory Hunt was convicted of capital murder in 1990, 2 years after Karen Lane's death. The trial wasn't lengthy, the evidence was too strong, the crime too clear-cut for extended deliberation. The jury heard about the 60 injuries inflicted on Karen's body. They learned about the broken bones, the lacerated organs, the torn aorta. They were presented with DNA evidence, fingerprints, and witness testimony that painted a picture of calculated brutality. Hunt's defense team faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you ask for mercy for someone who showed none? The jury's recommendation for death came by an 11-1 vote, not unanimous, but decisive enough to send Hunt to Alabama's death row. For the next 35 years, Hunt would become one of Alabama's longest-serving death row inmates. His appeals would wind through state and federal courts, challenging everything from the adequacy of his original defense to claims of prosecutorial misconduct. His final appeal, filed in 2016 as a successive Rule 32 petition, focused specifically on the sexual abuse evidence. Hunt claimed prosecutors had presented false testimony about the broken broom and other evidence, misleading jurors about this aspect of the crime. But courts consistently rejected these arguments. Whatever procedural questions might exist around his case, the fundamental facts remain unchanged. Gregory Hunt had brutally murdered Karen Lane. Gregory Hunt's final day began quietly on June 10, 2025. He was 65 years old, older than Karen Lane would ever be. He had lived 37 years longer than the woman whose life he had stolen in 1988. Hunt made an unusual choice for his last meal. He skipped dinner the night before his execution entirely. For lunch on his final day, he chose simple prison fare, bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. It was the kind of meal he'd eaten thousands of times during his decades on death row. Nothing special, nothing memorable. Perhaps the simplicity was intentional. After 35 years of waiting to die, maybe there was something fitting about ending with the same institutional food that had sustained him through his transformation from killer to minister. At 5:52 p.m., Gregory Hunt was escorted into Alabama's execution chamber. He was strapped to the gurney and covered with a white sheet. A blue-rimmed mask was placed over his entire face, the delivery system for the nitrogen gas he had selected years earlier, even before Alabama had developed full protocols for the method. Hunt had chosen nitrogen hypoxia over lethal injection or the electric chair, making him the 6th person to die by this method, the 5th in Alabama. The choice sparked ongoing debates about humane execution methods, but for Hunt, it represented his final act of agency in a process designed to strip away all control. After the death warrant was read, Hunt was offered the opportunity to speak final words. He declined to make any verbal statement. Instead, he offered 2 silent gestures, a thumbs up and what appeared to be a peace sign. The nitrogen gas began flowing sometime after 5:55 p.m. At 5:57, Hunt briefly shook and gasped, raising his head off the gurney. He moaned at 5:59 p.m. and raised his feet. Then came a series of 4 or more gasping breaths with long pauses between each one. By 6:05 p.m., Gregory Hunt had stopped moving altogether. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. In the wake of Gregory Hunt's June 10, 2025 execution, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey affirmed his guilt. highlighting the unimaginable final hours of his victim, Karen Lane. Hunt spent 35 years on death row, claiming religious transformation and leading Bible studies. This starkly contrasts with Karen Lane, who died at 32 from his brutal attack in 1988, having no chance for growth or peace. Hunt's execution, the fifth by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama, also reignited debates on humane methods, with witnesses describing disturbing final moments. The case underscores questions of justice, redemption, and whether a perpetrator's transformation can truly balance the debt owed to a victim who was denied any such opportunity. Karen Lane deserved to live and experience the life Hunt had, but her story ended in terror, while his concluded with silent gestures in the execution chamber. Want to see more content like this? Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated.